Rancher lived alone for years, until 3 saloon girls called him Father, the call of Father in the rain. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, enjoy the story. The wind of the Wild West howled across the open prairie, carrying with it the taste of red dust and the sharp chill of night. From somewhere far off, the faint cry of a harmonica drifted through the dark, blending with the steady beat of hooves striking against the dry, forgotten trail that led to a lonely ranch. Inside the ranch house, a single oil lamp flickered weakly, throwing shadows against the wooden walls. A man sat quietly by the fire, the weight of years pressing down heavier than the silence itself. Then it came through the storm, through the pounding rain, against the sagging roof, 3 urgent knocks on the door. He rose, his steps slow, his breath unsteady. When he pulled the door open, the storm rushed in, and with it appeared 3 trembling figures, soaked to the bone. And in that dark, merciless night, a word rang out, a word that shattered the silence he had carried for so many years. Father, the man who chose silence. On the high plains of Wyoming in the late 1880s, the wind swept endlessly across the open grasslands, carrying the dry scent of red earth and the weary creak of old fence posts. In the distance, the silhouettes of a few stray cattle pressed against the dusky purple sky, while along the trail the lone rhythm of hooves echoed into the emptiness. At the edge of that land stood a small ranch, tucked against a hillside. Its wooden door had faded to gray, its roof sagged with the burden of years, and the only sound that stirred the silence was the long, tired sigh of an old horse named Ash. Within that ranch lived Silas Ward, a man in his 40s, widowed for many years. Once he had been a fearless gun hand in troubled times. Once he had been a husband whose laughter filled a home. But loss had a way of hollowing a man, and in the years that followed, Silas locked his heart away, choosing a life of silence, shared only with his cattle and the faithful horse that never left his side. In town, they spoke of him with a kind of distant respect. They called him the Man of Silence. Every evening at sunset, when the fire in the hearth burned down to its last faint glow, he would sit unmoving, his eyes fixed on the empty wooden chair across from him, the chair that once belonged to those who would never return. And you listening to this story tonight? If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Chapter 1. The strange knock. The night storm swept down over the Wyoming plains with the fury of the heavens. Lightning split the sky wide open, revealing patches of red earth washed bare, and the broken silhouettes of trees bent low against the howling wind. From far away, there came the crack of a gunshot, perhaps a hunter chasing wolves, or perhaps only a memory echoing inside the mind of a man who had lived too long with silence. Silas Ward's ranch lay apart from the world, his weathered cabin swallowed in darkness. The tin roof screamed under the rain, every strike of water hammering like iron against iron. In the kitchen, a single oil lamp flickered weakly, its glow reaching only as far as the old revolver resting on the table. Silas sat there, calloused fingers brushing across the worn steel, a ritual he no longer needed except to remind himself he was still alive. Outside, his old horse Ash stirred restlessly in the stall. The animal was no stranger to storms, yet tonight, something in the wind unsettled him. He snorted hooves, stamping against the sodden ground as if warning of a presence that did not belong. Silas raised his head. There it was, a sound beneath the storm. Not the wind, not the rain, something else. For a moment he wondered if it was his own heartbeat. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound struck heavy against the door. Not once, but again and again, urgent, insistent, as though someone outside was battling the storm itself, just for the chance to be let in. Silas froze. It had been years since anyone had knocked on this door in the middle of the night. Folks from town never came this far. Travelers avoided the lonely ranch, half buried in dust and silence. Still the knocking went on. Ash whinnied softly, his breath steaming into the dark. Silas pushed himself up, boots groaning against the wooden floorboards. His hand rested on the worn grip of the revolver, not out of fear, but out of habit. In the West, a knock at night could carry salvation or ruin. The hinges screamed as he pulled the door open. Lightning flared. For a split second, the storm revealed them, 3 figures soaked through their thin clothes, clinging to weary frames. Their eyes, wide and unflinching, met his own. Rain streamed down tangled hair traced across hollowed faces. The one in the middle stepped forward, a young woman, her gaze sharp, yet steady. Her voice, hoarse but unyielding, spoke a single word: "Father." The world within Silas broke apart. His heart pounded as though every brick of the wall he had built year after year of silence, grief, and solitude was being torn loose by the storm. And in that instant, the wind, the rain, even Ash's restless cries, all of it fell away. Only one word remained echoing in the hollow chambers of his soul: "Father." The wind cut sideways across the porch, rain lashing like a whip. Silas kept his hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver, his eyes locked on the 3 figures before him. Somewhere out on the range, a single gunshot echoed distant, as memory near as a warning. From the stall, Ash gave a low, restless whinny, hooves pounding until the wooden door rattled in protest. Step under the porch, Silas set his voice rough and dry as desert sand. He leaned aside so the lantern light caught their faces. The one in the middle, the girl with calm, steady eyes, nodded once, then guided the younger 2 up the steps. Rain streamed down tangled hair, dripping onto the boards beneath them. Name Silas demanded no more than a single word. Clara, the girl, replied, gaze unflinching. "This is May and Ruth." May, the youngest, shivered from the cold, glancing around like a small bird lost in the storm. Ruth, her wet hair plastered against her temples, stood tall, eyes fierce, defiant, even against thunder. From the corrals came the uneasy bellow of cattle horns thudding against rails as lightning cracked too close. Silas's eyes swept them quickly the way only a survivor of the West could: hands, belts, skirts, boots. "Weapons," Ruth answered bluntly, "dagger in my boot. Not pointed at anyone." She slid the blade free and placed it on the step, an action less of surrender than a reminder that she'd learned to fend for herself. Clara lifted her empty hands into the light, a silent vow. May clutched a faded cloth bag to her chest, holding it as though it were the last warmth she owned. "You've come to the wrong man," Silas said, his eyes flickering like the lantern flame. "I'm not Clara," cut him off, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You are Silas Ward, the rancher with an old horse named Ash. 3 seasons of sandstorms swept the valley. Every night at sundown you light a fire, and you keep a silver spur nailed above the hearth. Lightning split the sky. Silas had no time to hide it. The spur gleamed exactly where she said it would be. Something inside him gave way, as though he had been dragged out from behind his own barricade. Behind him the heavens groaned, and out in the mud the cattle surged, crashing against the fence like the pounding of an overworked heart. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "From the town beyond the pass," Clara said. "We walked half a day, caught a freight wagon, then had to climb down when the storm rolled in. No one wanted to haul 3 saloon girls any farther." She paused. "But we didn't come here for a ride." A faint tune seemed to flicker through Silas's memory, harmonica notes, carried by wind from a night long ago, when he'd stood guard against a sandstorm, and a woman leaned against the porch post, her wet hair clinging as she stared into the dark. "Saloon girls." Silas muttered, his grip tightening on the revolver, a reflex born of suspicion, pity, or both. Ruth smirked. "If you're afraid of trouble, say so. We know how folks around here look at us." May only clutched her bag tighter, her wide eyes brimming with the fear of being stripped of the one thing left to her. A lightning bolt shattered the horizon, followed instantly by 2 gunshots from the valley, sharp, relentless, the kind meant to drive something back in the rain. The herd bawled and surged. Ash slammed his shoulder against the stall door, desperate for Silas's presence. Silas tilted his head, listening. Hooves moved through the storm, not cattle horses' riders. The restless presence of men he had known once back when he lived by his gun. He knew the kind of danger a storm carried with it: wanderers, raiders, men who hunted the weak. Inside, he ordered, "Stay near the fire. Strip off the wet clothes. No one touches my gun. Ruth lifted her chin. We don't need, not for you, Silas cut her off for the ones out there. They stepped inside. The door shut. Rain muffled to a roar beyond the walls. Warmth from the fire wrapped around their shivering frames. May crept closer, stretching small hands toward the glow, her skin marked with scratches as delicate as a cat's claws. Clara stood, tall eyes sweeping the room as if imprinting it to memory. The rough-hewn table, the empty chair across from it, the silver spur nailed to the wall, the folded wool blanket neatly set aside. Silas hung his own drenched coat on a peg and trimmed the lantern wick. The flames steadied, golden as honey. Outside, the cattle calmed their fear, easing as though reassured their keeper had returned. What did you call me earlier? Silas asked, eyes on the firewood snapping and popping. Clara's reply came without hesitation. Father. A faint, bitter smile touched his lips, not aimed at them, but at himself. Why? Because our mother said a horse knows blood before a man does. Clara nodded toward Ash, whose muzzle pressed anxiously against the stallboards. She said, if we were ever lost, to find the man who kept a silver spur and never touched whiskey on a storm night. Silas flinched. His glance flickered to the full bottle sitting untouched on the shelf. Another gunshot split the distance. His head jerked toward the door, eyes burning not from the fire's smoke, but from a storm swelling inside his chest. Ash reared, snorting like he meant to smash free. Silas raised a hand. Stay put. He lifted the lantern and cracked the back door open. Damp earth and beaten dust flooded in with the rain. Through the shifting veil of storm, 3 mounted riders crossed the ridge, heads bent low, oilskin coats, snapping the hurried shapes of men who hunted in the dark. He closed the door softly, like setting a stone on a grave. Were you followed? Ruth gave a short laugh. No one follows us. They follow what looks weak. May whispered. They asked if we knew the way to the lone ranch. We said no. Her eyes dropped as though apologizing to the very house that sheltered them. For a moment, silence hummed between the fire and their damp clothes steaming in the heat. Silas thought he heard the faint thread of a harmonica again, a tune from a night buried in sand and time. Have you eaten? He asked, his voice lower now, softened against his will. May shook her head. Ruth started to refuse, but Clara touched her arm, stilling her. If you have cornbread, we'd be grateful. Silas set an iron skillet on the fire. The smell of cornmeal rose plain but comforting. He moved to the window, lifted the curtain just enough. The herd was settling again, their dark, wet shapes swaying against the storm. Lightning tore the horizon, but the thunder had begun to drift farther away. How long have you lived alone? Clara asked, not curious, but as if measuring the heartbeat of the room. Long enough that folks forgot my name, Silas said. Ruth frowned. But they remember Ash. They remember the horse, Silas replied, because he still walks into town each season. I stay behind the wagon. He set down 3 chipped plates. Eat. May whispered, a shy thank you eyes round as the steam rose. Ruth inclined her head, still guarded but less rigid. Clara accepted her plate but didn't eat. Her gaze had caught on the empty chair in the corner and the old harmonica resting on the shelf above it. You can play it, she asked. Silas looked up, startled. What? The harmonica. Mother said, you once played for her in a sandstorm. She said the tune sounded like a lost train whistle in the desert. The fire snapped sparks, leaping like someone flicked a finger against the coals. Outside, the storm still clawed at the roof, but inside, another silence filled the room. The silence of past debts rising. Silas touched the instrument lightly. The metal was cold as time itself. I haven't played in years, he said, withdrawing his hand as though from hot ashes. Some things don't disappear, Clara replied softly. They only wait to be called. This time his smile was faint but real. He turned, adding more fuel to the fire, letting her words settle like seeds in damp earth. Outside, the rider's hoofbeats faded into mud and distance. Ash at last drew a long, weary breath, the sigh of an old creature who had climbed one more ridge. When the sky clears, I'll take you back to town. Silas said, his voice like nails driven into timber. Ruth laughed sharp. Back to what? To stares and whispers. To a saloon owner who'll sneer because we came back empty-handed. May's spoon clattered against her plate. The thin sound spread through the room. Clara's eyes never wavered. We won't go back. We came to find you. The wind shifted, pushing the curtain as though someone outside had exhaled. Silas stood in the center of his own house and felt the ground tilt beneath him like sand washed loose in a flood. Once he had known how to say no, swift and sure as drawing steel. Tonight the word lodged in his throat. Far off, a final shot rang out and was swallowed by silence. The storm was passing. But inside the ranch, a different storm was just beginning to rise, summoned by 3 rain-soaked daughters, an empty chair, an old harmonica, and a name long buried now spoken aloud. The fire in the wood stove cracked and popped, throwing Silas's shadow long across the weathered wall. He sat unmoving, chin resting against one hand, staring at the 3 girls as though they had torn open the curtain of memory he had spent years trying to bury. Outside, the rain still fell heavy, but the thunder had rolled back into the mountains. Only the wind remained sweeping low across the ground, carrying dust and weeds with it. In the stall, Ash had gone still as well, breathing steady like an old friend, assuring him for now the danger had passed. Clara set her plate of cornbread down and slowly untied the faded cloth bag. In the lantern's amber glow, she drew out a piece of paper, its edges torn from long travel, its ink blurred where rain had seeped in. This was our mother's. Silas glanced at it and shot to his feet as if burned. He didn't need to read. The loops and flourishes of the hand, the bold strokes of each letter, he knew them. He had traced them silently in his mind night after night before forcing them down into the dark. Clara laid the letter on the table. Her voice was steady but trembled at the edges. She said, "If the day came when we wanted to know our father, we should come to this ranch. She isn't here anymore." But her words remain. The air thickened, pressing the room into silence. Wind hissed through the cracks like whispers from someone unseen. May clutched her dress tight, her eyes wide on the man before her. Ruth's fists balled, the only way she could keep from shaking. Silas reached for the letter. His rough fingers trembled. He swallowed hard vision, swimming not from the blurred ink, but from the tears that blurred his own eyes. For a moment the cabin spun, pulling him back to another night years ago. A woman standing on the porch in the rain, her clothes soaked, her eyes unyielding. She had said she wanted no claim, no title, only love. And she had walked away when she realized he lacked the courage to choose. His hand shook so violently the letter slipped onto the table. The firelight caught the last line still legible. "If one day they come to you, please do not turn them away." Silence smothered the room. From the far ridge came the long, lonely howl of a wolf. Silas sank into the chair, his face hollowed, aged 10 years in an instant. He pressed a hand to his brow. His voice scraped out hoarse-broken, "You don't know what you're asking of me." Clara met his eyes, unwavering. "We're not asking. We're only calling the right name." In that moment, Silas felt his heart split along a hairline crack. He wanted to shout, to deny, to run into the storm and let it scour him clean, but all he could do was sit there while a single word pressed on him heavier than stone father. He rose abruptly, shoving the letter into his coat like a live coal. Grabbing his oilskin still heavy with rain, he thrust blankets toward them. "Out to the barn. Ash isn't calm and the cattle neither. Wrap up, stay close to the lantern. Don't stray from the light." The door opened, and the night rushed in like a wild beast, still panting. The rain had lightened, but the wind tore across the yard, dragging mud and dust into dark streaks. The fences rattled under the cattle's horns, their eyes flashing white with each strike of lightning. From the ridge, a gunshot cracked, fading into 3 echoes, a reminder that everyone out here was watching everyone else. Silas walked ahead, storm lantern tied to his wrist, its golden beam cutting a narrow path through the rain. May clung to her bag. Ruth crouched, low eyes darting toward every shadow as though counting exits. Clara moved steady breath, measured her gaze fixed on the hoofprints Ash had left in the mud prints only someone who had been waiting would know to follow. At the barn, Ash pressed his head against the latch, his breath fogging in the lantern light. When Silas unhooked the bar, the horse swung its head slowly, neither panicked nor wild, but searching, measuring the wind in the bodies before him, his ears tilted toward the three girls. May flinched back half a step. Ruth held her ground, though her hand instinctively dropped from where a knife once rested. Clara stepped forward, palm open, body lowered ever so slightly to meet him with respect. Ash, Silas murmured, using a tone he hadn't spoken in years, low, soothing, touched with gentleness. The horse lowered his head, nostrils brushing Clara's palm, drawing in a deep breath. A shiver rippled along his spine mane, lifting in the rain. He leaned closer, nuzzling her skin, inhaling as if seeking a memory. In that suspended moment, the storm faded away. No rain, no wind, no clatter of hooves, just the breath of a horse and the breath of a girl, joined as one. "Don't move," Silas warned the younger two, though his eyes never left the subtle language of Ash's body. An old truth rose in him, one he had once spoken to another woman on another storm night. A horse never mistakes the blood it knows. Ash turned to May, snorting softly. She reached out without thinking, her small fingers smudged with mud. Ash licked her hand once, quick and gentle, like a parent soothing a child. Then Ruth. She didn't raise her hand. Ash tilted his head, waiting, asking without words. Ruth, caught off guard, let her shoulders drop, her edges soften. At last, she opened her hand. Ash pressed his muzzle against it, patient, until her fingers uncurled. "See?" Clara whispered, speaking not to Silas, but into the warm breath of the horse. Mother said, "When blood is not enough for trust, a horse will be the bridge." Lightning tore the heavens. Its cold light flashed in Ash's eyes, in the girls', and in Silas's own 3 mirrors, reflecting a truth breaking the surface like rock rising after flood. And there, at the edge of sight, 3 riders showed themselves on the ridge. Oilskin coats draped low, their eyes sweeping every cabin still lit against the storm. One jerked his reins, his horse rearing at the thunder. He raised a hand to shield his gaze, peering hard towards Silas's barn. In that instant, every survival instinct inside Silas drew taut like a bowstring. Behind the barn, Silas said quietly, "Stay out of the light." He pulled the door half shut, set the lantern on the ground, and slipped the revolver from its leather holster as though shedding an old ghost. His shadow stretched long across the yard as he stepped out into the rain. The herd had bunched tight in a corner of the corral, their flanks spattered with mud breath, steaming in nervous bursts. The rider in front stopped at the outer fence, his eyes sharp, unfriendly. Bad night to keep a lantern burning, friend. He drawled, his accent rough with the crossing of mountain passes. "Bad night to mistake another man's land," Silas replied, shifting just enough so the lightning caught the steel of his gun. "This place don't shelter hunters in a storm." Silence fell. The wind yanked a tattered flag on the fence post until it snapped like old bones, laughing. The man flicked a look over his shoulder, gave a small signal. The 2 riders behind shifted in their saddles, eyes glinting under dripping hats. From the barn came Ash's hooves, sharp iron ringing against wood. A sound the rustlers of this country had learned long ago to take seriously. Silas lifted his gun and fired one shot into the sky. The crack rolled through the valley, echoing threefold, the cattle scattering in a circle but holding the fence. "Not fond of noisy neighbors, are you?" the rider sneered. "I like peace," Silas said evenly. "By my law. And out here the laws ride on." 2 heavy breaths of tension. Then the horses shifted hooves, striking mud. The 3 riders slipped off into the rain, their shadows swallowed into the grass, their hoofbeats thinning like a harmonica tune cut short. Silas lowered his gun slowly, his fingers sliding from the trigger as if extinguishing an oath. When he returned to the barn, the lantern still glowed gold. Inside, May was whispering softly to Ash. Ruth leaned against a beam, steadying herself as she tucked the knife back into her dress. And Clara stood at the horse's brow, one hand against him, eyes closed in something like a prayer. As Silas stepped near, Ash lifted his head, pressed his breath against Silas's chest, then nudged his muzzle toward Clara, a decision made. Silas paused as if a man lost on the trail had suddenly found a signpost. He pulled a lead rope from the hook and handed it to Clara. "Hold it," he said, his voice no longer edged like a blade, but warm as wood cured in the sun. "He'll stay calm if you do." Clara's fingers trembled as she took the rope, but her shoulders stayed firm. Ash settled his ears, tipping toward her voice as she soothed. "Easy now. We're home." Something tight within Silas's chest loosened at her words as though a cord wound for years had slackened. He glanced out across the corral. The cattle had stopped ramming the rails, their wet eyes turned toward the light. The wind had softened the rain, thinning to silk. Even the groaning fence seemed to sigh instead of scream. Silas knew the storm outside was passing, but the one within him had only just shifted its wind. "You'll sleep in the loft tonight," he said, turning to Ruth and May. "Blanket's lantern ladder at the end. Don't touch the traps, I set them for mice." He stopped a beat of hesitation, then added words sticking in his throat. "If you get cold, call me." Ruth nearly scoffed, a habit sharpened by too many doors closed in her face. But her eyes fell on the rope in Clara's hand, a line stretching from horse to sisters to the man himself, and instead of mocking, she only nodded. For the first time, May smiled shy and small, but true enough to warm the lantern glow another degree. Clara remained where she was, Ash's brow pressed against her shoulder, as though a memory had finally found its rightful home. Silas lingered on the sight too long, then turned shoulders stiff. On the high shelf, the old harmonica rested, its dull silver dimmed by soot and years. Silas lifted it, weighing it in his hand, not to play, but to measure again the weight of a lifetime. "You still remember the old tune?" Clara asked softly. Her voice carried on the horse's breath like dust brushed from glass. Silas didn't answer. He raised the harmonica near his lips, drew in air, then let it out without a sound, testing not the instrument, but the storm still unsettled in his chest. Beyond the barn, the prairie quieted. The herd lay down, their dark bodies settling into the earth like a bedtime hymn. Rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof, no longer wild, but weary. Silas returned the harmonica to the shelf, his hand easing as he let go. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low, "I'll mend the east fence. The herd's changing their path. We'll need fresh posts. Anyone willing to help wear gloves?" Ruth curled her lip, the kind of smirk born of too many disappointments, but she nodded before she could stop herself. May whispered, "I can mend nets, but wood I'll learn." Silas gave the smallest nod, barely there. He slid the bolt across the barn door, turned the lantern down until the light was just enough for them to climb the ladder. When he stepped back into the night, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of wet grass, horsehide, and something new, the faint scent of home beginning. That night, gunshots had sounded, cattle had scattered. Strangers' eyes had swept across his house. But now the danger had rolled on, leaving behind a fragile thread in his barn. Ash lying down at peace, the rope still in Clara's hand, thin as a reed, but strong enough to hold a roof over them all. Silas closed the door. His palm lingered on the wood, warm, impossibly warm for a storm night. For the first time in years, he felt the ranch's silence was no longer empty. It was full, waiting for something to grow. Rain fell light as silver threads across the roof. The fire in the hearth still glowed, casting not just heat, but a gentle patch over the cracks of a hardened heart. Silas sat alone at the table, eyes on the crumpled letter. Each word cut him open, the name, the plea, the last line. "If one day they come, do not turn them away." He saw her face again, steady eyes, the tender smile before she left, and the loss he had never had the courage to fight for. Above him, May and Ruth slept, their breaths drifting through the boards. Clara remained awake, below, one hand on Ash's rope, her eyes fixed on the night beyond the window. They spoke no words, yet in that silence more was said than language could carry. Silas knew then, the moment they knocked in the rain and called him by that word, the past had risen, the wall he built had cracked. He could no longer pretend it was mistake. Ash had bowed his head to them. The letter was proof, Outside, the prairie whispered wind singing its lonely song. Inside, Silas felt the real storm begin, the fear of admitting, the ache of remembering, and the faintest spark of something he thought long buried: family. He leaned back, eyes tracing the dark ceiling beams, and asked himself the question no gun could answer. Are they truly my blood? And if they are, do I have the courage to call them daughters? The fire whispered on ash, sighed in the barn and under his roof. 3 shadows, one steady, one defiant, one innocent, slept at last in the house of silence. Chapter 2. The letter from the past. The oil lamp hanging from the beam hissed faintly, its weak yellow glow swaying as though it might gutter out at any moment, throwing Silas's shadow long across the cabin wall. The ranch kitchen lay silent, broken only by the wind rattling the door and ash shifting uneasily in the stall, as if to remind them the night was not yet safe. Silas sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his weathered hand resting close to a whiskey bottle he had never emptied. Across from him, Clara sat straight-backed, her rain-soaked face lit by eyes that burned bright even in the dim. Ruth leaned against a post, arms crossed, as if she were waiting for judgment to be passed. May curled small by the fire, her round eyes fixed on the coals as if searching for protection in their fading glow. No one spoke. The silence was so heavy that each gust of wind striking the door sounded like a creditor come to collect. At last, Clara slipped her hand into the faded cloth bag. The gesture was slow, careful, like she carried something that could set the whole room alight. When her hand emerged, she held a single page yellowed with age, its edges frayed, its ink blurred by rain. She laid it on the table before Silas. Her voice came low, hoarse, but steady. "This is our mother's letter," she said one day. "If we wished to know where we came from, we would need to place it in your hands." Silas went rigid, his eyes locked onto the page as if he were staring at a ghost. One glance was enough. He knew the hand, the slant, the softness of the curves, the way every line trailed at the end like a breath held and never released. Years of trying to forget unraveled in an instant memory, surging like a sandstorm across the plains. He reached out, but his fingers trembled too violently to grasp the edge. A gunshot echoed faint from the valley, jolting him so hard the letter quivered in the draft. Outside, the cattle pressed to one corner, hooves pounding mud in rhythm with his own thundering heart. Clara nudged the letter closer, read it. Silas lifted it slowly. He drew a deep breath, but it caught halfway, strangled. The paper felt thin as ash, yet heavier than the steel revolver that had ridden his hip for half a lifetime. The firelight danced in eyes that had been dry for years now, glassing as if ready to break. He opened it. The first line burned him cold. "Silas, if this letter has reached you, then I am already gone." The words struck like a blade. His grip tightened on the page, eyes closing, but the voice of the past still rang in his skull like wind cutting across the desert, like the harmonica he once played for her in a storm long ago. For a heartbeat, he was no longer the hardened rancher before the fire. He was young again, a harmonica in his hands, standing on the porch as a woman turned and walked into the dark. His breath came fast, ragged. He wanted to fold the letter, to throw it into the flames, to bury the memory again. But Clara's gaze pinned him where he sat, sharp, unwavering, a lantern that refused to let him flee. Outside, the wind shifted. The cattle shoved against the fence wood, groaning like a heart ready to splinter. Ash whinnied, stamping not in fear of storm, but as though he too sensed his master was being dragged back to a truth that could not be denied. Silas raised his head. His eyes were red, his throat too tight for words. All that came was a broken sigh, torn like a confession half made. Clara laid her hand flat on the table. Her voice was quiet but carried like a hammer's strike. "Our mother is gone. But we are here, and we need to know. Will you turn your back on us again?" The lamp trembled, its flame fluttering as if even the fire itself waited for his answer. Silas held the letter, eyes sinking to the next lines. Each word carved deeper, unearthing the pain he had buried. "I did not need you to choose me over honor or land. I only needed you to look in my eyes and say I was loved. But you were silent. And in that silence I knew I had to leave." His knuckles whitened around the page. The image surged up unstoppable her under the porch in a sandstorm. Hair tangled her eyes, tormented yet still waiting. And him, once a gunman, without fear choosing silence instead of love. The storm had taken her, and with her the one chance he never found the courage to claim. Wind roared through the cracks, now pushing red dust across the floorboards. Ash struck the stall floor in steady rhythm like a clock counting down. Silas swallowed hard and forced himself on. If you are reading this, then you are older now, and I will not have enough time to return, but I did not go alone. I left you 3 children. They do not need money. They do not need your name. They only need to know if their father has the courage to call them daughter. Silas's hands shook so violently the letter nearly fell into the fire. He clutched it back, clutching as if it held not paper, but her very soul. May's eyes widened, her small hand clutching Clara's sleeve. Ruth bit her lip, her stare fixed on Silas's face, once carved of stone, now cracking apart. Clara's voice came soft, but glowed with fierce light. Now you understand why we came? Silas bowed his head, breath uneven shattered. His whole life stood laid out in those words, a man who could drop outlaws in the dust without a tremor, yet could not speak one truth to save love when it mattered. Another gunshot rang from the valley, bouncing 3 times across the ridge. The herd broke into chaos again, horns battering the rails. Silas lifted his head, eyes wet lit as though something had struck him awake. His voice cracked raw as torn earth. I left your mother. The room collapsed into silence. Only the wind moaned through the door, cracks the fire snapping in the stove, and 3 pairs of eyes fixed on the man once known as the Silent Gun. Clara did not cry. She let the silence itself be the verdict, a judgment heavier than any accusation. Silas pressed on, forcing his eyes to the final lines. If they come to you, give them a hot meal, a roof to rest under, and one simple word, Father. The page trembled in his hands, not from the wind, from a heart once stone, now fracturing along every seam. Silas folded the letter, but his hand couldn't let go. It trembled, sweat seeping into the thin paper, smudging the ink further like blood leaking from an old wound. He rose, chair scraping harsh against the floorboards, the sound slicing the room like a blade. He couldn't sit still. He pushed out onto the porch. The storm slapped him full in the face, rain sharp as whips, bitter salt on his lips. The sky was a pit of black, torn open only when lightning flared, revealing clouds twisted like beasts. From far off came a single gunshot, echoing over the ridges before fading into silence. Silas stood there, the letter clutched in his hand, staring into the void. In his mind, doors long bolted were flung wide open. He saw himself 15 years younger, 20-something, revolver at his hip, his laughter loud in a saloon. And then she walked in long brown hair eyes that were both steel and gentleness. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. No cheap glance, no forced smile. She looked at him as if he were simply a man. Not a gun, not a rancher, a man. Then came the night of the sandstorm, when the 2 of them sat on this very porch. He played his harmonica, rough notes broken by the wind, while she rested her head against his shoulder. The storm raged, yet within its howl was a warmth so fierce he thought he could give up land honor, everything, just to hold it. But when she asked, "Do you have the courage to call me wife in front of the whole town?" he had been silent, and in that silence everything died. The rain stung his face now, but he didn't flinch. The letter weighed on him like a stone across his chest. Behind him, the door creaked open. Clara stood there, lantern light spilling over her, her shadow stretching across the wet earth. "You can hide from the town from other men," Clara said softly, her voice striking like a drumbeat. "But you can't hide from memory, and now you can't hide from us." Silas turned. Lightning carved across the sky, laying bare his face, drawn gaunt, but eyes shining wet. His throat tightened. No words came. Only the wind moaned through his teeth like a groan. Clara didn't step closer. She left the distance between them like a wound unhealed. But her eyes, steady beneath the lamp, made him bow his head. Ash whickered low from the stall, pawing at the ground, his hooves drumming like a summons inside the man's chest. Silas clenched the letter rain, mingling with tears on his face so no one could tell them apart. And inside him one question beat like the storm itself. I was silent once. Do I have the courage to speak now for 3 daughters? He shut the door against the wind. The cold came in with him anyway. The lamplight cast deep lines across his weathered face, carving him harder still, as though time itself held a knife. The 3 girls remained in the kitchen. May huddled close to the fire, small hands clasped wide-eyed as a fawn in the dark. Ruth leaned against the post arms, folded her jaw-tight lips pressed thin to conceal the tremor in her shoulders. Clara still sat at the table, the ruined letter between them, her gaze calm, not cold, but steady as stone. Silas sat, his breath heavy as though he had walked 100 miles in one night. He set the letter down again, his calloused fingers tracing its edges, torn between clinging and casting it away. His voice came raw, broken into shards. I was a coward. That night your mother waited for me to speak, and I said nothing. I chose silence, and in that silence I lost her. I lost all of you. May's eyes blinked fast, her hands gripping her dress. Ruth clenched her jaw, but in her dark blue eyes flickered a rare, unguarded softness. Clara sat still, her eyes glistening, not with accusation, but with the weight of hearing aloud the truth her mother had left behind. Silas pressed on, voice shaking like a rope about to snap. Your mother? She was the only one who ever saw me, not as a gun hand, not as a man clinging to land. She saw my heart, and I let that heart die. He drew a breath so deep it dragged the storm inside him, then released it. If you hate me, if you despise me, I will not blame you, because I abandoned you before you were even born. The words fell into the fire's crackle like stones into a well. The lamp guttered its light, flickering with his heart bright, then dim. Clara laid both hands on the table. Her voice came slow but unshakable. We didn't come to judge you. We came because we need a place to call home. Can you give us that? Silas looked at her, then to Ruth, then May. His eyes blurred, drained dry by confession. But somewhere deep in the ashes a spark broke through, small but real. From the stall, Ash nickered low, then sighed heavy, his sound rolling into the room like a witness testifying the truth had been spoken. Silas buried his face in his hands. He had lived with Gunstorm's suspicion. None of it cut deeper than the gaze of 3 daughters, eyes both strange and familiar, where he saw himself staring back. The ranch kitchen lay hushed. The silence wasn't judgment. Now it was waiting. Waiting for a verdict, not from a court, but from the man's own heart. At last, Silas lowered his hands. His eyes were bloodshot but brighter. He looked at each face, May trembling but hopeful, Ruth defiant but weary, Clara calm and steady like their mother before them. He drew one long breath, wind rattling through lungs that had been dry for years. Tonight, you'll stay here. The loft's got blankets, a lamp, not much but warm. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but tonight I will not turn my back. May let out a soft cry, clutching at her dress. Ruth turned aside, but her lip quivered, the last shield cracking. Clara closed her eyes. One tear slipped down, but when she opened them, her gaze burned fierce, alive. Silas rose, fetched wool blankets from the shelf, and laid them before the girls. His gesture was clumsy but solid. From the stall came Ash's snort, deep and approving. Sleep. Silas said, his voice rough but gentle, foreign even to himself. The rain will stop, and tomorrow, maybe we'll begin again. The girls stood slowly, taking the blankets. At the ladder to the loft, Clara paused. She turned back, held his gaze a long moment. No words, only eyes, half challenge, half gratitude. When the loft door closed, Silas remained alone with the fire and the letter. He sat once more staring at the blurred lines, his fingers trembling along the last words. If one day the children come, please do not turn them away. The fire snapped. Ash exhaled, then lay down, a living witness to the promise just made. Silas leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the black rafters while one question told in his heart like the wind in the eaves. Can a man who once failed find the courage to be a father when it may already be too late? Chapter 3. The horse remembers. Dawn crept carefully over the Wyoming high plains, a pale light slipping through clouds still heavy with last night's rain. The pasture shimmered with puddles, long streaks of mud cutting across the valley like scars. Far off, a lone gunshot cracked, echoing 3 times against the ridges before fading, reminding all who listened that the West was never fully at peace. In the corral, the cattle shoved at the rails, mud splattering their flanks, then settled again with heavy, restless breaths. Silas stepped into the yard, his oilskin still wet from the storm draped across his shoulders. Dark hollows sat beneath his eyes. He had not slept. His hand still carried the weight of the letter, thin as ash, yet heavier than the revolver that had ended too many lives. The barn stood silver in the early light. Ash waited there, the old horse weathered by years, his mane matted with dust. He stood proud, but his breathing was slow and deep, like the sigh of an old friend who had seen too many storms. Behind Silas came the 3 girls. Clara walked first, calm, steady, certain. Ruth followed close, her sharp eyes alive with tension. May the youngest trudged with boots heavy in the mud, clutching her faded cloth bag, her gaze caught between awe and shyness. Ash lifted his head, nostrils flaring, his ears pricked forward toward the 3. He stamped once, a hollow, deliberate note like the opening drum of a silent trial. Silas stopped, fingers tightening on the lead rope hanging from a post. His voice came low, rasped, raw. Ash knows a blood breath sooner than a man does. Clara stepped forward, her palm open, steady. Ash tilted his head, brown eyes deep as wells, as though peering through time itself. Slowly, with the patience of age, he lowered his head, pressed his muzzle against her trembling hand. A long sigh left him, and for a moment the air itself seemed to break open. The cattle quieted, the wind hushed, leaving only an echo faint as memory, that storm night years ago when another woman had offered her hand and Ash had answered. May moved next, hesitant, her small fingers streaked with mud. Ash sniffed once, then brushed her hand with a swift, gentle lick. May laughed, a bright, sudden laugh that rang across the morning, turning the damp air warmer. Ruth lingered last, her hand hidden in her coat, eyes locked hard on the horse. Ash stood before her ears, flicking patient. He stepped forward, nudged her shoulder, not rough, but enough to jar the defenses she wore. Ruth blinked, lips tight. At last she drew her hand free, opened it with reluctance. Ash touched it gently, waiting until her fingers tense as iron loosened. Silas stood silent, as though the horse had spoken the verdict he himself could not. The stern lines of his face cracked, his eyes burned, red lips trembling against words unsaid. Ash drew a breath that steamed in the morning chill, then lowered his head, letting all 3 sets of hands, mud-streaked, rain-damp, rest upon his mane. The dawn brightened, not with sun, but with trust that once a horse had given it no man could deny. Silas turned away, hand gripping the rope, hiding the tears brimming in his eyes. The wall of silence in his chest shuddered like a barn beam before collapse. Ash stood motionless, the girl's hands on him, his old eyes drifting shut as though dreaming of the past. His breath rose like mist, mingling with the thin morning fog, as fragile as memories buried in red dust. For Silas, memory struck like a flood. He was young again, riding Ash across a sunburnt plain, the horse's black mane, flying hooves, hammering the hard earth like war drums. Behind him, her laughter. The woman's arms wrapped around his waist, her hair whipping into the dust. And the night of the sandstorm shelter in a rocky hollow, Ash bracing at the entrance while the gale howled. She leaned against him, her eyes alive in firelight. Ash doesn't fear storms, she'd said. He only fears not finding the way home. Then she had looked at him, her voice trembling but firm. And you, Silas, do you fear not finding your way back? He had been silent, as he always was, and silence had cost him everything. Now, as Ash lowered his head to these girls, the truth rose unshakable. The horse needed no proof, no words. He remembered. The breath of blood was enough. Silas braced himself against the barn post, knees, weak vision swimming. The dawn wind whistled through the rafters, sounding like a broken harmonica tune unfinished waiting. Clara's eyes lifted, meeting his. There was no blame in them, no anger, only the quiet certainty of truth revealed. The horse had spoken what he could not. May's smile bloomed, small, fragile, but real. Ruth turned aside, but her hand stayed pressed to Ash's neck, her guard slowly falling. Silas closed his eyes. The woman had been right. A horse knows the blood before a man admits it. And now, there was no place left to hide. Ash snorted softly, then pressed his forehead against Clara's chest, passing back a memory he had carried all these years. Silas stepped out into the morning sun. His heart still ached, but not with denial. It ached with the pain of a man who at last had looked truth in the eye. The sun climbed higher, spilling a pale light across the grasslands, thin rays piercing through the ragged veil of clouds. Mist burned away in patches, revealing a valley scarred with muddy streaks and tufts of grass beaten flat by the storm. Silas led Ash out of the barn, meaning to walk the old horse along the corral. Behind him, the three girls followed like shadows, unwilling to fall away. They hadn't reached the fence when the sound of hooves rose from the dirt road to town. Red dust curled up in the distance, and soon 3 riders appeared. They halted just outside the rails, their eyes sweeping past the girls before settling on Silas. Ward, the lead man, drawled, his hat brim low, his grin sharp. "Heard tell this old ranch of yours don't just keep cattle anymore. No, sir. Folks say you're boarding saloon girls." The other 2 chuckled, their laughter dry and cutting. A crow shot up from the fence post, its harsh cry ripping through the air. Ruth's fists clenched, and she stepped forward, but Clara laid a steady hand to stop her. May dropped her gaze, face burning with shame. Silas stood still, one hand on Ash's halter. The horse stamped ears, pinned back, nostrils flaring. He did not know the insult, but he felt it, and answered with his hoof striking hard into the mud. Maybe the rider went on, "You're just too tired of your own silence. Needed a little saloon laughter to keep you company." His gaze flicked toward the girls, mocking. "Town's already talking, Ward. You keep 'em here, and this place'll be no better than a whiskey parlor." Silas lifted his head slowly. His eyes, bloodshot from a sleepless night, burned now with a sudden fierce light. He stepped forward, Ash pressing at his side. The cattle stirred, lowing dust, swirling like storm clouds. "Listen close," Silas said, his voice hoarse but hard. "They're not saloon girls to me. They're my daughters." The words rang out like a gunshot fired broadside in daylight. The girls froze, eyes wide. Clara fought to keep her calm, though her lips trembled. Ruth swallowed hard, jaw tight. May clutched her dress, tears welling fast. The riders stared silent a beat, then barked harsh laughter. "Daughters, Ward, you're gone soft in the head. No one in town's fool enough to believe that." Silas didn't answer. He only laid his hand on Ash's neck. The old horse screamed through his nostrils, pawed high, and slammed a hoof down with a crack that sent mud flying. The corral shook with the thunder of cattle bawling, horns battering rails, a roar rising like a sandstorm across the valley. The riders' horses shied ears, flicking their riders, pulling reins tight. They knew Ash. Every man in this valley knew him, the horse who had faced down rustlers, storms, and fire without flinching. If Ash made his stand here, it meant only one thing. He had chosen. The air fell heavy. Dust swirled. The lead man spat into the dirt, his jaw stiff. "Suit yourself, Ward. But the town won't forget. You bring 'em in, you bring their shame with 'em." He jerked his reins, turned. The others followed. Their hoofbeats trailed off, leaving behind only the taste of scorn thick in the air like smoke after a shot. Silas stood where he was, his palm trembling against Ash's neck. His heart hammered harder than any night he'd faced raiders with a gun in hand. But this was not about cattle. This was about 3 girls standing behind him waiting. Ash lowered his head, pressing his brow against Silas's shoulder, a quiet oath. The horse had chosen too. And that meant the truth could no longer be denied. By midday, the clouds had thinned the sun, laying a weak gold across the prairie. Inside the ranch kitchen, for the first time in years, the old table was not empty. Silas set down a pot of beans, steam curling with the simple scent of salt and smoke. Awkwardly, he fumbled chipped bowls in front of the girls, his rough hands meant for rope and iron, so clumsy he dropped a spoon. May burst into a laugh, light and quick. The sound spilled across the room like water over parched ground, softening the air. Ruth sniffed, pretending at disdain, but her mouth curved despite herself. Clara said nothing, only drew the pot toward her and ladled 3 equal servings. Silas sat opposite. The kitchen that once echoed only with wind now filled with the scrape of spoons, the blowing of hot beans, small laughter breaking through uneasy silences. From outside came Ash's long, steady breath. The horse stood still, ears tipped toward the window, as if listening. Every time laughter rose, he stamped once, as though keeping time with it. May looked up, a smear of beans on her cheek, and smiled shyly. If you truly are our father, then maybe this is the first time we've ever eaten together. Silas's throat closed tight. He could not say yes, but neither could he deny it. He only bowed his head slightly, eyes fixed on the steaming pot. Ruth leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand, gaze sharp on him. The town won't believe it. To them, we'll always be saloon girls. Dusk sank slowly over the valley. The last light of day spilled a wash of amber across the rain-soaked plains, painting the corral and the barn roof in soft, fading gold. The wind drifted low and gentle, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and tender grass sprouting fresh after the storm. From far off came the lonely crack of a gun, echoing once through the gorge, before dying away, just another reminder that the West never truly slept in peace. Silas stepped out into the yard, the dust of the hearth still clinging to his shoulders. Behind him came the 3 girls, each at her own distance. May skipping half a step, Ruth silent, her eyes always measuring, and Clara steady, her gaze tracing every move the man made. Ash waited in the center of the yard, head lowered, his mane lifting softly in the evening breeze. When he saw them, he whickered low and moved forward. No rein, no call, no command, until he stood before Clara. He bent his head once more, pressing against her hand. Clara trembled, laying her palm on his brow. Then Ash turned to Ruth, brushing her shoulder, and for an instant her sharp eyes blurred with something softer. At last he stooped lower still so May could throw her arms around his neck, laughing into his mane. The sight struck Silas like a blow, and a blessing all at once. His chest tightened, yet in that pressure a space opened wide enough for light to enter. In the glow of sunset, it was plain the old horse was no longer just his companion. Ash had become a bridge, a witness, a voice speaking aloud the truth he could no longer deny. Silas stepped near, laying his calloused hand upon Ash's mane. The horse did not shy, but edged closer, so that all 4 of them touched him together. In that instant, the ranch was no longer the refuge of a solitary man. It had become a home. The western sky bled red, then deepened to indigo. The cattle in the corral lowed once, then fell still, lining the fence as if to bear silent witness to a ceremony no words could name. Silas's voice broke the hush, rough and unsteady. Ash has chosen. And maybe I can't deny it any longer. Clara lifted her eyes, shining but dry. Ruth turned her face aside to hide the red rim of her gaze. May only laughed, still clinging to the horse's neck, as if the storm of the night before had never been. The old man watched them, his heart pounding like war drums, and he knew the wall of silence he had built across the years had finally fallen. Ash sighed, bowed his head one last time, leaving behind a silence heavy but warm, as though sealing a truth into eternity. The sky closed on the day, but for the first time in years the rancher's heart opened, and so he asked himself as the night gathered round, if it were you, after all these years of silence, would you have the courage to speak and call them your daughters? Chapter 4. The First Days. The next dawn broke pale and thin across the Wyoming sky. Blue light spilled low over fields still scarred by last night's storm puddles, pooling in the dirt like mirrors of the heavens. The cattle bellowed to one another in the corral, stirring up red dust from the damp ground. Far away, a single gunshot cracked, echoing off the ridges before fading. In this country, no shot was ever meaningless. It always reminded a man how thin the line was between living and dying. Inside the ranch, for the first time in years, Silas did not wake alone. From the loft above came the faint shuffle of feet, the whispered voices of May and Ruth, the creak of boards beneath Clara's steady step as she descended. Those sounds were no longer the hollow echoes of solitude. They beat like a new rhythm in the heart of the house. Silas pulled on his coat and stepped to the porch. The morning wind cut cold, but something unfamiliar stirred inside him warmth. In the yard, the three girls already stood with sleeves rolled high, hair still damp with dew, looking over the ranch as though they intended to make it their own. "Work here isn't easy," he said, his voice rough but no longer cold. Storm knocked out the east fence. "Leave it, the herd will scatter." Clara nodded once. "Show us how, and we'll do it." Ruth hefted a hammer, her small hand gripping it firm. May toted a basket of old wire, her smile bright, though her lips were still blue from the chill. Silas froze at the sight. For years he'd known them only by rumor girls in saloons under false lights and cheap music. But now, under the clean light of morning, he saw three pairs of eyes that needed no lamp but the sun. Together, the four of them went to work. Silas hauled the broken posts, Clara steadied them. Ruth drove nails, and May fumbled with the wire. The hammer rang sharp, the cattle lifted their heads, and Ash let out a long, proud whinny, stamping the ground as if in approval. At one point, Ruth's hammer slipped the head, glancing off the post. May gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Silas's hand shot out, steadying Ruth's wrist. Her breath caught, then she gave the faintest nod, her eyes softening just a fraction. Clara saw it, and her lips pressed tight against the rush of feeling that rose in her chest. By noon, the fence stood firm again. The sun sat high, casting its harsh light, but the sheen of sweat on their brows glistened like proof of something earned. Silas looked up and saw the girls laughing together, their voices ringing across the pasture. For a moment, he remembered when this ranch had once known the sound of a woman's laughter, and he realized the house was silent no more. On a ridge beyond the valley, a lone rider reined in, watching the ranch with eyes like ice. The sun blurred his features, but Silas knew the gossip in town would not die easy. Yet when he turned and saw the girls at the fence hammering life back into broken wood, he understood what folks whispered no longer mattered, as much as the sound of their work, ringing like nails into the bones of a new beginning. Ash lowered his head to fresh grass ears, still tilted toward the family in the yard, bearing silent witness. If the horse had chosen to believe, then the ranch already had its family. That evening, the prairie lay under a weary gold light. Rainwater still shimmered in the grass like scattered glass, reflecting the herd as they grazed behind the mended rails. From the mountains came the faint report of another gunshot, fading quickly, as though to remind them the West was still a land of danger. But inside the ranch house, for the first time in years, smoke rose not only from the stove but from a cooking fire. Clara fed kindling to the flames, her hands awkward where once they had balanced trays of whiskey glasses. Ruth pounded corn in the mortar, her strokes clumsy but determined, muttering to herself as if to prove her own strength. May darted about with a basket, gathering stray eggs from the corners of the barn, giggling as if she had stumbled on treasure. Silas sat at the table, silent, watching. For so long, this kitchen had held nothing but a pot of beans, a crust of bread, and his shadow flickering on the wall. Now the room was alive with sound, wood, snapping eggs, clinking laughter tangled with mock scolding. It struck him in the chest, strange and sweet, like a house waking after a long sleep. "Careful." Ruth Clara warned, eyes on the fire. "You'll break the mortar." Ruth snorted. "If he complains, I'll throw it out the door." Silas's lips twitched. He hadn't remembered he still knew how to smile. Rising, he crossed the room and gently took the pestle from Ruth's hand. "Let me." The sound of his strokes, steady, heavy, joined the hum of the house. For a moment, Ruth watched him, not hard-edged, but like a child letting her father show her the way. May piped up with glee. 3 whole eggs. She set them on the table, cradling them like gold. Silas froze, struck by her joy. How many years had it been since he'd seen a child's eyes light up over so small a gift? His chest tightened with the ache of all he had missed. When at last the meal was set, corn porridge, a few strips of dried meat, 3 eggs divided evenly, the 4 of them sat around the old wooden table. No one spoke at first, as if each waited for the other to begin. Silas cleared his throat, voice rough as gravel. "Your mother, she used to make corn porridge, always put in honey. I never could get it right." Clara's eyes shadowed, then softened. Ruth bowed her head, her spoon clattering against the bowl to hide the shine of her eyes. May only laughed bright and simple. "Then tomorrow we'll find the bees." Her laughter broke the heaviness spilling into the room. Ruth laughed too sharp and short, and Clara let out a sigh that sounded almost like release. Silas looked at them all, his heart beating hard, and in that moment he heard it, the sound of family laughter alive again in a house that had once been nothing but quiet. Outside, Ash snorted and stamped once as though adding his own note to the song. The next morning, the wind swept low across the prairie, carrying the damp scent of earth and the sweetness of grass reborn after the storm. Out front, the old garden showed itself again, long neglected, overrun with weeds, its fence leaning its soil cracked and patched with mud. Silas hadn't set foot there in years. Alone, he could never keep the herd and keep the land alive. This used to be a garden. May asked wide-eyed, her tangled hair lifting in the breeze as she brushed back weeds. Silas rasped. "Your mother, she liked to plant pumpkins, beans, always managed a pot or 2 for the table." The air stilled. Clara crouched, low eyes sweeping the patch as though she could summon her mother's memory back into the earth she once tended. Ruth set her hands to her hips, then seized a hoe with firm resolve. "Then we start again," she said. The first strike bit the ground like iron, breaking silence. Silas lifted another hoe slower but sure, each stroke releasing the smell of wet soil, rich and raw. Clara gathered weeds into neat piles. May darted about, laughing, tossing rocks clear of the rows. Bit by bit, the garden took shape. Dark living earth breathed again. The sound of hoes, the lowing of cattle, the sweep of wind across the valley, all merged into a rough, honest hymn of work. Riders passed along the trail, reining in. Their eyes lingered sharp on the ranch, their laughter carrying. Ward's raising saloon girls to grow vegetables now. Maybe they'll water the beans with whiskey and smoke. May stiffened her small fist, clutching a stone. Ruth flushed red, gripping the hoe as if to hurl it. Clara caught her arm, holding her still, answering only with eyes cold proud. Silas straightened, sweat tracing the lines of his weathered face. He gave no word, only drove his hoe into the earth, each strike ringing hard enough to drown the mockery. From the barn, Ash screamed his cry, rolling like thunder, a defiance for them all. At last, the riders spat dust and moved on. Silence returned, broken only by the breath of 4 people working side by side. Clara lowered her hand to the fresh-turned soil, her voice steady. "Earth doesn't care what we were. It only asks who's willing to tend it, same as us." Silas met her gaze. A crease deepened at his eyes, but softened with light. He nodded once. In that moment, the garden ceased to be weeds and ruin. It had become hope. That evening, the prairie sky flared red and violet, pouring its soft glow over the newly mended fence. The fields still shone damp from rain, the smell of fresh-dug earth mingling with the dry hay in the breeze, strange but comforting. The herd stood calm, lowing softly as if to bless the work done. Silas perched on the rail boots caked with mudshirt dark with sweat. Beside him, Clara leaned against a post, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun slid into the mountains. Ruth dangled her legs, twirling the hammer in her hand, tossing her wet hair back with a shake. May sprawled in the grass below chest, heaving with breathless laughter, grinning as if the whole day's labor had been nothing but play. Ash wandered over, lowering his head toward the little one in the dirt. May giggled, stretching her hand to his brow. "You're kinder than your master, aren't you, Ash?" The horse snorted warm breath on her palm. Ruth burst into laughter. "Careful, if he sneezes, you'll be drenched." The sound of their laughter carried across the wide fields. Clara joined in, soft but true. And Silas, after so many years, felt his lips bend into something unfamiliar. Not the bitter smile of old, not the weary curl of regret, but a true smile, awkward and stiff, yet real. "It's been a long time," he said, voice rough, "since I've heard laughter in this ranch." Clara turned to him, steady and sure. "Then let us fill it again." The last light of sunset flickered in Clara's eyes, a steady flame that carried the strength of her mother's gaze, etched forever in Silas's memory. His chest ached, but for once he did not turn away. He let the pain stay, let it mix with the moment. The wind swept the prairie, red dust rising, but it could not drown out Ruth's laughter, May's bright chatter, or Clara's quiet, unshaken calm. A ranch that had known only the voice of wind and cattle now carried for the first time the sounds of a home. Ash stood by the fence, ears pricked forward as if listening too. He stamped once, a low, solid thud, his own confirmation that this ranch no longer belonged to Silas alone. Silas drew a long breath, pulling in the scent of fresh-turned earth, of sweat, of 3 girls who had called him father. Inside him, the wall of silence was nearly gone. Night fell. A pale moon drifted behind thin clouds, casting a silver wash across wet fields. The cattle lowed softly and the corral crickets filled the stillness, weaving a hymn for the quiet west. Inside, the oil lamp flickered warm light across 4 faces gathered round the wooden table. On it sat a pot of bean stew cornbread fresh from the fire and strips of dried meat. Simple fare, but the steam, the clink of spoons, and the hum of voices filled a room long empty of life. May grinned wide, breaking a piece of hot bread, wincing at the heat. "This is better than anything from a saloon, I swear." Ruth lifted a brow, stubborn but softer at the edges. "Saloons only serve thin whiskey and cheap laughter. Here, at least the taste is real." Clara said little, her eyes calm as she served another spoonful into May's bowl. "Eat. Tomorrow there's more work. A ranch doesn't run itself." At the head of the table, Silas sat still, his chest drawn tight, not from pain, but from a tender ache he barely recognized. For years he had lived with nothing but wind howling at the shutters, gunfire echoing through the valley, the restless stir of cattle in the night. But now, the clink of spoons against bowls, the laughter that rose and fell, the soft sighs of comfort, they filled the silence with life. A memory slipped in years ago. A woman sat across from him in this same kitchen lamp, burning low, her eyes shining as she laughed. "A house isn't alive," she told him, "until it holds laughter." Her words returned now, weaving through the present like a promise finally kept. From the barn came Ash's long snort, then the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, like the heartbeat of the ranch itself, measured unshaken. Silas lifted his spoon, but paused his gaze, fixed not on the stew, but on the 3 faces bent over their meal. And for the first time in years, a thought bloomed warm and near unbearable in his chest. Maybe family has come back to me. The lamp crackled. Shadows of 4 figures stretched across the wooden wall, blending into one shape, silent testimony that the storm had not destroyed everything. The ranch was no longer the refuge of a lonely man. It rang now with laughter, with clattering spoons, and with the steady beat of a new family's heart. And so I ask you, do you believe that sometimes a simple meal is enough to turn a silent house into a true home? Chapter 5. A Father's Words. Sunset bled across the Wyoming plains, red as fire tearing through the sky. Long shadows stretched from the leaning fence posts, and the cattle's mournful lowing rolled heavy across the prairie. The wind lay still, but the silence carried weight, as though the land itself held its breath before a coming storm. Silas stood against a fence post, his calloused hand gripping the worn leather strap. The red light carved his face, deepening every line like old wounds laid bare. He stared out toward the horizon, where a few riders from town had just passed, their mocking voices trailing like lashes across his back. Ward brought the saloon home to his ranch. Does he think a few ruined girls will make him a father? The hoofbeats faded, but the sting remained. Silas had grown used to names like the mute of the grasslands, used to suspicion and half-truth whispers. But today the words cut deeper, for they struck not only him but the 3 pairs of eyes standing behind that fence. May lowered her head, fingers twisted tight. Ruth clenched her teeth, eyes blazing as if she'd charged the whole town herself. Clara stood still, her gaze calm but burning bright, unmoved by scorn. Silas turned, looking at them. His chest tightened. He remembered that storm-soaked night when the door flew open, when 3 trembling voices shattered his silence with a single word, Father. Since then they had mended fences together, turned the earth of a dead garden, shared their first meal beneath the glow of an oil lamp. The ranch, once filled with nothing but wind and echo, now carried laughter, clattering spoons, even the weary sighs of warmth. Yet still, he had not spoken the one word aloud. A gunshot cracked in the distance, echoing 3 times across the canyon. The cattle panicked, pressing horns against each other, dust rising in frantic bursts. The sound pressed against him, sharp as memory. In the West, life and death always walk the same trail. But the storm inside his chest was fiercer still. He gripped the reins, veins rising blue across his hand. His lips trembled, eyes burning red, as though the silence of a lifetime fought to hold him back. Then at last his voice broke free, hoarse but thunderous, splitting the sky itself. If you want, you may call me Father. The words fell into the hush like a gunshot in the night. The air shattered, striking the heart of each one of them. May burst first, tears spilling as she ran forward, wrapping her small arms around his waist. Pa, if you'll allow it, then from this day, that's what I'll call you. I've always wanted a father. The word Pa pierced him sharp and tender as a blade against his hardened heart. Silas froze, hands suspended before lowering one rough palm onto her shoulder. Awkward, halting, but weighted with a lifetime. Ruth stood near her face, defiant, but her voice faltered as she forced it through clenched teeth. I don't want a father out of pity. But if you mean it, then I'll call you Pa too. The words cracked against the silence, hard yet fragile, and Silas saw himself in her stubborn, closed, but aching for a place to belong. Clara remained still, the sunset crowning her in firelight. She stepped forward, steady and unwavering. Pa, she said, voice low, solemn yet ringing clear. This word has lived in my chest too long. Tonight, I can finally speak it. Silas dropped to one knee, arms trembling as he pulled all 3 into his embrace. His tears fell hot onto their hair, mingling with their own. From the corral came the deep chorus of cattle, Ash's cry rising sharp above it, his hoofs striking the ground like a drum. Laughter, sobs, hoarse and heard, all rose together, weaving a wild hymn of rebirth. Silas's voice broke again, repeating the vow so the prairie itself would hear, If you want me, from this day, I will be your father. And for the first time in years, the ranch was no longer a place of silence. It was filled with trembling voices, with laughter through tears, and with the beating heart of a family found. Word traveled faster than wind. By the next morning, the whole of that small Wyoming town was whispering Ward brought 3 saloon girls back to his ranch. He calls them his daughters. Laughter curled through the saloon, the mercantile, even in front of the church steps. That afternoon, Silas rode into town with Clara, Ruth, and May to buy nails, canvas, and salt. From the first stretch of the dusty street, every eye turned their way. Merchants' wives clutched their husbands' arms, tugging children aside. Cowboys lounged at the saloon, whistling, mocking Ward. Guess even an old man needs a saloon to keep him warm, huh? Ruth's blood burned hot. Her hand dropped to the knife at her belt, eyes blazing fire. But Silas raised his hand, steady and stern. Slowly he dismounted, boots striking the earth with heavy steps. The street hushed, all waiting. He walked to the center of town, sunlight bleeding red across wooden signs, catching the sharp gleam in every doubtful gaze. His voice rasped low but carrying far. Hear me well. These are not saloon trinkets. They are not the trash you whisper about. They are my daughters, and I'll protect them the way I've always protected my cattle, my land, my name. The words cracked across the street like a whip. A few faces faltered, though most held on to their sneers. From the saloon corner came a sharp laugh. "Daughters, will you swear it on your gun, Ward?" Silas turned. The light caught his worn face, eyes burning like live coals. He drew the old revolver, raised it high. A single shot split the sky. The bullet slammed into the saloon's weathered sign splinters, raining down. Horses reared the whole street, jolting with the echo. He lowered the gun, his voice grave and unshaken. "I swear it on my gun. And if anyone doubts me, try crossing the Ward fence." Silence. Only the wind spoke, dragging dust down the street as eyes dropped one by one. At the far end, Ash reared his cry, ringing out across the valley like a battle drum, sealing the vow. Clara looked at him, then her eyes bright with something new. Trust. Ruth swallowed hard, her grip loosening on the knife. May lifted her chin, smiling through tears, whispering a single word, "Pa." In front of the whole town, Silas Ward had chosen no longer silent, no longer hiding. He had claimed them, and the West itself had heard. Evening deepened as they rode back. The dirt road stretched, long dust curling like smoke behind their horses. But unlike when they'd arrived, none of them bowed their heads. Clara rode upright, gaze fixed on the horizon. Ruth gripped her reins firm, no tremor in her hands. May hummed under her breath, as if sweeping away the weight of the day. At the ranch gate, Ash cried out, his voice echoing across the prairie. The cattle raised their heads in chorus, lowing as though to welcome them home. Inside, the fire cast its glow on 4 faces around the wooden table. The meal was plain bean stew, strips of dried meat, fresh greens pulled from yesterday's garden. The wind still sighed through the shutters, but it mingled now with the sound of spoons tapping bowls of contented breath. At the head of the table, Silas laid his hand on the wood, calloused, trembling. All his life he'd used that gesture to signal orders to ranch hands or warnings to gunmen. But tonight he tapped once for courage. He looked at the girls. May legs tucked up, her face smeared with dust but smiling bright. Ruth arms, folded eyes still sharp but softened with watchfulness. Clara calm, her eyes glowing in firelight so like her mother's that it stole his breath. Silas drew in deep, voice rasped but steady. "Eat. Tonight's supper belongs to our family." The words flared like fire in the night, warming what no one thought could be warmed. May laughed through tears. Ruth lifted her chin, lips parting, but then pressed shut, her eyes shining bright instead. Clara lowered her spoon, nodded once, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you, Pa." The word struck like a seal pressed in wax, unbreakable, undeniable. Silas bowed his head, eyes wet. He lifted the bowl to his lips, tasting not only beans and broth, but something he thought he'd lost forever, the taste of a home. From outside came Ash's long breath, a hoof striking earth, echoing deep as a pledge. The ranch had a family now. The next day the sun fell again, fiery, brighter than ever before. The sky burned its flames, spilling across the prairie, casting long shadows over the new fence, standing straight and true like a vow driven into the earth. The wind was still. Silence lay heavy over the land, broken only by the distant, ragged cries of cattle. Silas walked forward, boots striking the dust in steady rhythm. He stopped at the fence-lined shoulders, square gaze fixed on the 3 girls waiting beside Ash. They looked up at him together, their eyes carrying a weight of hope too long deferred. The crimson light carved his weathered face, and in that glow, his eyes no longer wavered. When he spoke, his voice came low and rough, but it carried like thunder, breaking the hush of the plains. "The world can call you whatever it pleases, but here on this land, if you'll have me, I will be your father." The words rolled like a gunshot through the valley. The herd bellowed as dust rose in thick clouds, and Ash reared back, crying out before bowing his head to the 3 girls, as if sealing the vow. May collapsed into tears, rushing to wrap her arms around his legs. Ruth bit down hard, but the word escaped her lips, trembling. "Pa." And Clara stepped close, laying her hand on his shoulder, her eyes alight with the same tender flame he once thought he would never see again. Silas pulled them all into his arms, voice breaking but strong. "From this day on, you are no longer the cast-off. You are my blood. And this ranch is our home. The sunset blazed higher like a crown of fire, and blood laid atop that once lonely ranch. Yet in that moment, the house ceased to be a hollow silence. It became something else entirely, a family. A man who had spent a lifetime locked inside his silence had finally spoken the only words 3 daughters had ever needed to hear. Justice didn't need a jury. It only needed a father's truth. And so I leave you with a question. If you were Silas after years of silence, regret, and the weight of a broken past, would you have the courage to speak those words at last? Would you say, "I will be your father"? Wild West Stories night settled over the prairie. Inside the ranch, firelight flickered across rough-hewn walls, casting the long shadows of 4 souls gathered around the old wooden table. On it sat a pot of bean stew, steaming rich, a loaf of cornbread still warm, and tender greens pulled from the garden they'd only just begun to tend. For the first time in years, the ranch was no longer filled with only the moan of the wind and the groan of old timber. Now it carried laughter, the soft clatter of spoons against bowls, the quiet exhale of warmth. May giggled without restraint. Ruth let out a laugh that surprised even herself, and Clara, always steady, always composed, wore a smile as fragile and luminous as a crescent moon. At the head of the table, Silas sat motionless for a moment, eyes lingering on the 3 faces across from him. Then slowly he lifted his bowl. His voice, worn and gravel-deep, rang with a truth too long buried from this day forward. "This is our family." The words seemed to rattle the beams of the house itself, echoing like a rifle shot down through the valley. From outside, Ash cried out his call, rolling into the mountains like a witness sworn forever to the truth just spoken. In that instant, the pain inside Silas's chest quieted. A man who once believed he had lost everything, who chose silence over love, finally understood it is never too late to be claimed and to love in return. The oil lamp wavered. Smoke from the fire curled upward, ribboning into the rafters, binding 4 once scattered lives into something whole. And here, in a West scarred by prejudice and rumor, 4 outcasts had chosen the one thing stronger than any storm: each other. Family isn't born of perfect bloodlines. It is forged by the courage to admit the truth and the choice to stay. Do you believe a family can be born out of a truth once buried? Share your thoughts below. And if you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.